The streets of London were slick with rain as a group of rough men stumbled through the night, seeking trouble. It was the kind of weather that made you want to find warmth, but for Derek and his crew, warmth wasn't what they were after. They were looking for an easy target, someone they could mock, belittle, and feel superior to. Tonight, they found it in two black men walking down a dimly lit alley. "Look at them," Derek sneered, eyeing the two strangers. "Think they own the place?" His words were thick with contempt. The men, tall and imposing, wore dark coats and walked with quiet confidence, but it only fueled Derek's need to show them their place. "Hey!" Derek shouted, his voice breaking the stillness. "Where do you think you're going?" The two men didn't flinch. The taller of the two paused but didn't turn around. The other, quieter man, kept his head lowered as if already aware of the storm coming their way. "I'm talking to you." Derek's voice cracked as he moved closer, shoving the taller man in the shoulder. "You think you're too good for us?" The man barely reacted, his calm gaze meeting Derek's with no fear, no emotion. Derek's face twisted with anger as he pushed harder, forcing the man to stagger back a step. His gang laughed behind him, egging him on. "Hey, don't ignore us," another member of the crew chimed in, stepping forward. "Think you can walk these streets like you own them?" The taller man finally turned his head, his expression unreadable. "We're not looking for trouble," he said, his voice calm, yet firm. "You should walk away." But Derek wasn't having it. His ego, inflated by whiskey and the crowd around him, couldn't tolerate being dismissed. "Oh, I don't think you get it," he said, grinning. "You're in my city now. You'll show some respect." The other men laughed again, moving in closer, making a circle around the two strangers. "Yeah, show some respect, tough guys," one of them said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you can show us some royal manners." "Royal?" Derek spat, his voice rising. "You think you're kings or something? You're nothing." He stepped forward again, grabbing the taller man by the collar. "You think you're above me?" he taunted. "Let's see how tough you really are." The man didn't fight back, his hands remaining at his sides. But the quiet one finally spoke, his voice still calm but heavy with warning. "You don't want to do this." Derek's grin widened. He was having fun now, the tension in the air only fueling his need to dominate. "Oh, I think I do." With one swift movement he shoved the taller man again, this time pushing him into the wall. The sound of the impact echoed in the alley, and Derek's crew cheered. But still, the man didn't react. His calmness was unnerving. Derek's hand shot out to strike him, but in a flash the man twisted his wrist, using his own momentum against him. In an instant, Derek was forced to the ground, his arm twisted painfully behind his back. The gang fell silent. Derek groaned, trying to break free, but the grip was too strong. The taller man stood over him, his calm eyes now filled with something far more dangerous. "You were saying?" the man asked coldly. Derek gasped for air, trying to pull away, but the grip only tightened. The other men, stunned, didn't know how to react. It was clear now, these were no ordinary men. "What the hell is going on?" one of the criminals whispered, fear creeping into his voice. "Let him go." But the taller man didn't move. Instead, he shoved Derek harder into the ground, silencing the rest of the crew. "You came here looking for trouble," he said, his voice low, calm, but filled with authority. "Now you found it?" A knife flashed from the shadows. One of the gang members, desperate and scared, lunged toward the man, hoping to catch him off guard. But in a split second, the shorter man stepped forward, his movements almost too quick to see. He grabbed the attacker's wrist midair, twisting it with practiced ease until the knife fell to the ground with a loud clatter. Derek, still struggling to get free, watched in disbelief as his crew floundered. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were supposed to break these men, not the other way around. Don't even think about it, the quieter man said, his voice now cold as ice. The others hesitated, the knife wielder clutching his wrist in pain. The gang was no longer laughing. They were panicking. "Who the hell are you guys?" one of them whispered, a hint of awe creeping into his voice. The taller man released Derek's arm, pushing him away with a final shove. Derek scrambled to his feet, still dazed and humiliated. He didn't want to admit it, but he had never felt more helpless in his life. "Just two men trying to get home," the quieter one replied, his eyes narrowing. "But you crossed a line. And now you'll learn that there are consequences for that." Derek's face reddened with rage and humiliation. His crew was no longer behind him. They had seen what had just happened, and the reality was starting to set in. They were no longer the ones in control. With a final glance at Derek, the two men turned to walk away, leaving the gang standing in stunned silence. The alley was still, the only sound the distant hum of the city as the two black men disappeared into the night. Behind them, Derek's gang stood frozen, their pride shattered, their bravado melted away. They had picked the wrong fight. The consequences of their racism, their aggression, had come to a head. And now, all they could do was stare into the dark, knowing they would never forget the lesson they had just learned. The cold, damp night felt heavier as Derek and his crew stood motionless in the alley, trying to process the humiliation they just endured. The anger that had driven them moments ago was now replaced with a gnawing feeling of unease. The two men they had attacked weren't just ordinary targets. They were something else entirely. "Did you see that?" One of Derek's crew members finally spoke, his voice trembling. "That guy was like a bloody machine." Derek's mind raced. How had it gone so wrong? He had expected to show these men their place, but instead, they had been the ones made to look weak, powerless. "What do we do now?" another member of the crew asked, his tone now full of fear. "We can't just let them get away with this, right? They made us look like idiots." Derek clenched his fists. His face was red with frustration. "We're not letting this slide. I don't care who they are. They'll regret crossing me." But even as he spoke, doubt crept in. He wasn't used to being the one on the ground. Those men, they hadn't been ordinary. They hadn't even broken a sweat. Derek's hands trembled with uncertainty. "We have to find them," Derek muttered, his voice tight. "We'll teach them a lesson. They won't get away with this." "But how do we even find them?" one man asked. "They just disappeared. Like ghosts?" Derek hesitated, trying to push down the unease that still gnawed at him. "Don't worry about that. We'll find them. And when we do, it'll be over." Meanwhile, the two black men walked deeper into the night, the quiet one's voice breaking the silence. "That was too close," he murmured, his voice tense. "They'll come after us." The taller man didn't respond immediately. He was still processing what had just happened. "They're dangerous." "I know," he said after a moment. "But we'll be ready." "Maybe," the quiet man replied, his tone cautious. "But we can't underestimate them. They're not just any gang." They moved quickly through the streets, but the unease didn't leave them. The feeling of being watched hung over them like a dark cloud. They could hear distant footsteps behind them, but when they turned, no one was there. The city, usually familiar, felt like an unknown maze. Their confrontation with Derek's gang had made things more dangerous. Back in the abandoned building where Derek and his crew gathered, the sense of humiliation was still thick in the air. Derek paced back and forth, a man on the edge. "We're going after them," he spat. They think they can make me look weak? We'll make them regret it. One of the men, still shaken, spoke up. But they're different. They took you down without a second thought, Derek. Shut up, Derek snapped. We're finding them, and when we do, they won't walk away. But even as Derek's words rang with bravado, the unease in the pit of his stomach wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right. He had been in many fights, but this felt different. These men weren't just trying to prove a point. They were calculating cold. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into something much deeper than a street brawl. The next night, Derek's crew hit the streets again, this time with a renewed sense of desperation. They had to find the men who had humiliated them. They split up into pairs, scanning every alley and corner for any sign of their targets. Then one of the men spotted them. "I see them," he whispered urgently, pointing down the street. Derek's heart skipped a beat. "Where?" At the far end of the street, the two men were standing as calm and collected as before. Their eyes locked onto Derek's crew with unsettling precision. It was like they had been waiting for this moment. Derek's pulse quickened. This time they would be ready. This time, they would show these men who was in control. As they approached, the tall man spoke, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "You came back." Derek gritted his teeth. "We didn't forget what you did to us." The quiet man stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You should have. You don't know who you're dealing with." Derek's anger flared, but beneath it was something deeper, fear. The calmness of these men unnerved him. They didn't act like ordinary criminals. They weren't intimidated, not even by the numbers. "We're not done with you," Derek growled. "You'll pay for what you did." The taller man studied him, his eyes cold. "You've made a mistake," he said. "But now you're too far in to turn back." Derek took a step forward, his fists clenched. "You'll regret crossing us?" The quiet man raised an eyebrow. "We'll see about that." Suddenly, the tension in the air became unbearable. The streets, once familiar, felt alien. The gang members stood behind Derek, their confidence waning. The men before them weren't just enemies. They were something else, something dangerous. Derek's crew hesitated, unsure of what to do. They had underestimated these men, and now they were paying the price. The quiet man's eyes scanned the gang, his gaze unwavering. "Turn back," he warned, his voice low. "Before this escalates." But Derek, his pride too wounded to listen, stood his ground. "We won't back down." The quiet man's lips curled into a faint smile. "Then so be it." Without warning, the two men moved in a blur of motion. In an instant, Derek found himself flat on his back, his breath knocked out of him. His crew tried to charge, but the quiet man effortlessly disarmed one of them, while the taller man knocked another to the ground with a single, swift strike. The air was thick with tension as Derek's gang scrambled to regroup. But it was clear they were outmatched. The men before them weren't just strong. They were efficient, precise, and completely unfazed by the fight they were in. The gang was no match for them. Derek's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to his feet, fear now fully consuming him. "Who the hell are you?" he spat, his voice laced with desperation. The taller man's voice was calm, almost eerily so. "We're the ones you should have stayed away from." And with that, the two men turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Derek and his crew standing in stunned silence. They had lost. Worse than that, they had been exposed. And now, they were left with only the sting of defeat and the realization that they had made a terrible mistake. The reckoning was just beginning. The city felt colder as Derek paced in the dimly lit warehouse. He had been humiliated, and the need for revenge burned like a fire inside him. His crew, however, showed signs of doubt. The two men they had tried to ambush weren't ordinary. They had made a fool of them, and Derek couldn't stomach that. "Tonight, we end this," Derek said, trying to control the rising panic in his chest. "We're going after them, no more mistakes." One of his crew members, still shaken, spoke up. "Derek, are you sure about this? We've lost every time we've tried." "We're not backing down," Derek snapped. "We're getting them tonight." Meanwhile, the two black men prepared for the inevitable. They had anticipated the gang's next move. The quiet man, eyes sharp, surveyed the alleyway outside their hideout. His partner, the taller man, was more relaxed but no less alert. They knew Derek's crew was coming for them again. This time, though, they were ready. "They'll be here soon," the quiet man said. "We need to be prepared." "They won't expect us to fight back this time," the tall man replied, his voice calm but with a cold edge. As Derek and his crew made their way through the foggy streets, a sense of unease settled in. This wasn't their first time planning an ambush, but something about this night felt different. The cold air seemed to press in on them, and the silence of the streets unnerved them. "Stay focused," Derek barked. "This is it." They arrived at the warehouse, the location Derek had chosen. It was isolated, dark, perfect for an ambush. Derek signaled for his crew to take positions. But as they moved deeper into the building, a strange feeling settled over them. Every footstep echoed too loudly in the silence. The two black men watched from the shadows. They had seen the gang approach, but they weren't worried. They were trained for moments like this, trained to wait, to strike at the right moment. "The trap is set," the quiet man whispered. "We'll give them a taste of their own medicine," the tall man replied, his voice low. As Derek's crew spread out, a sudden noise made him freeze. A creak from behind. His heart skipped. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Tension grew thick in the air. Suddenly, the door to the back room swung open, and there they were, the two men. The quiet man stood in the doorway, calm, collected. The tall man followed closely, his eyes scanning the room with military precision. Derek's crew immediately raised their weapons, but the two men didn't flinch. "You think you can take us down?" Derek growled, trying to steady his shaking hands. The quiet man spoke, his voice chilling. "You should have stayed away." Before Derek could react, the tall man moved like lightning, slamming one of Derek's men against the wall with a sickening thud. The quiet man disarmed another, twisting his arm with terrifying ease. Panic erupted in the air. Derek's crew tried to regroup, but they were outmatched. One by one, they were incapacitated with swift, brutal efficiency. The two men were everywhere at once, their movements fluid, precise. Derek's crew was no match. "Fall back!" Derek shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. He turned to run, but the quiet man was already in his path. "Running won't save you," the quiet man said, grabbing Derek by the collar and lifting him off the ground. "You'll pay for what you did." Derek's heart raced. Fear gnawed at him as he struggled to break free, but the grip was too strong. The quiet man's cold eyes never wavered. "Who are you?" Derek managed to gasp. The quiet man leaned in close. "We're the ones who make people like you disappear." With a final, swift motion, he slammed Derek to the ground, knocking the air out of him. The tall man stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You made a mistake coming after us," the tall man said, his voice low and steady. "This is where it ends for you." The last thing Derek saw before his vision blurred was the two men turning their backs on him. They were leaving him alone, battered, and broken. The trap had been sprung, and Derek had walked right into it. The reckoning was complete. The harsh sound of footsteps echoed through the cold, empty streets. Derek's body ached as he dragged himself out of the warehouse, battered and bruised, his pride shattered. His crew had been taken down one by one, each of them crumpling like paper beneath the relentless force of the two men. But it wasn't just the physical pain that gnawed at Derek. It was the crushing realization that he had failed, that he had miscalculated, that he had misjudged his enemies completely. His vision blurred with every step, his breath shallow and ragged. He stumbled, his body unsteady, but he couldn't stop. The darkness of the night seemed to press in on him, suffocating him with every passing moment. He had to get away, had to regroup, had to think of a way to get back at them. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the quiet man's cold, unfeeling gaze, and the tall man's overwhelming presence. "Get up," Derek muttered to himself, dragging his feet. "Get up and finish this." Meanwhile, the two men, the quiet man and the tall one, walked calmly through the city's empty streets, unaffected by the chaos they had just caused. They had left Derek and his crew behind, but the satisfaction of their victory wasn't what fueled them. It was something deeper, something more urgent. "We need to move quickly," the quiet man said, his eyes scanning the darkened alleyways around them. "Derek won't let this go. He'll be back." The tall man nodded. "We know. He's already broken, but he won't stop until he's forced to." Their pace quickened as they made their way to a more secure location. They weren't worried about Derek's crew. They had seen enough to know they weren't a threat. But Derek, the leader, was different. He was driven, relentless. And that made him dangerous. Derek finally made it back to his hideout. The pain from his injuries was sharp, but it didn't matter. His mind was consumed with rage. He could still hear their voices, feel their hands on him, the way they effortlessly dismantled his crew. His men, his brothers in arms, were gone. And it was his fault. He had underestimated them. He stumbled into the dimly lit room, his hand clutching the side of a table for support. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached for his phone. His fingers fumbled as he dialed a number he knew by heart. "Get me everything on those two men," he spat into the phone. "I don't care what it takes. I want to know everything." The voice on the other end hesitated before responding. "Derek, we've been looking into them. But these guys, they don't leave a trail. It's like they're ghosts." "Then find the ghosts," Derek growled. "I want them. I want them to feel what I felt." The next day, Derek's obsession took full hold of him. He spent hours scouring the internet, following every lead, tracking down every shred of information about the two men who had humiliated him. The more he dug, the more frustrated he became. There was nothing. No records, no social media, no connections. It was as if they had never existed before the night they crossed paths with him. But then a breakthrough. One of his men, a former hacker, had found something. A hidden file. It contained an old military report, one that was deeply classified. The two men's names were there, encrypted and buried deep within the government's archives. And what Derek found shocked him. The quiet man and the tall man were former special forces, elite soldiers trained in the most deadly combat techniques. They were more than just thugs. They were professional killers. And now, they were back and they were playing by their own rules. "This changes everything," Derek muttered, his hand trembling as he stared at the screen. "This isn't some street fight. This is a war." Back at their hideout, the quiet man and the tall man sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. They knew Derek would come for them again, but they weren't worried. They had anticipated this. Derek had one thing going for him: his anger. But it was also his greatest weakness. He was reckless, desperate, and now that he knew who they were, he would become even more dangerous. "We should go," the quiet man said, his voice steady. "He's learned about us. It won't be long before he comes for us again." The tall man gave a slight nod, his gaze distant. "I know. But we'll be ready." Hours passed. Derek had put everything he had into finding the two men, but what he hadn't counted on was the sheer scale of their skills. The intel he'd gathered only deepened his fear. They weren't just two men. They were a force. And he was about to be their target. It was late at night when Derek finally made his move. He gathered the few remaining men he could count on and set out, determined to track down the two men once and for all. This time, there would be no mistakes. He had the knowledge, he had the resources, and he wasn't going to let them slip through his fingers again. They headed for the old industrial district, a place they had used before for their operations. It was isolated, dark, and the perfect place to corner the two men. Derek felt the adrenaline pump through his veins as they moved through the shadows. He could feel it. This was it. This time he would win. But as they entered the district, something felt off. The air was thick with tension, and Derek couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his instincts screamed at him to turn around. But it was too late. They were already surrounded. The tall man stepped out from behind a stack of crates, his figure illuminated by the dim streetlight. The quiet man was beside him, his eyes cold and calculating. Derek's men immediately raised their weapons, but the two men didn't move. They simply stood there, waiting. "This is your last chance," the quiet man said, his voice low. "Leave now, and we won't finish this." Derek's heart raced as he surveyed the scene. They were outnumbered, but the quiet man and the tall man weren't afraid. They were confident, and that terrified him. "You don't scare me," Derek spat, his voice filled with defiance. "This ends tonight." The tall man's lips curled into a smile. "No, Derek. It ends when we say it does." The final confrontation had begun. The air felt suffocating as Derek's men positioned themselves in a semicircle around the two black soldiers, guns raised, their hands trembling in anticipation. Derek's jaw was clenched tight, his body tense, as his eyes flicked between the quiet man and the tall man. He had underestimated them before, and that mistake would cost him everything. This time, he wasn't going to let it happen again. "You should have stayed out of this," Derek growled, trying to sound more confident than he felt. His crew tightened their grips on their weapons, waiting for the signal to strike. The quiet man didn't flinch. The tall man remained eerily calm. It was like they had been here before, like they had already fought and won this battle 100 times in their minds. "This is your last chance," the quiet man said, his voice calm but menacing. "Leave." "No." Derek laughed bitterly, his eyes filled with rage. "You think you can scare me? I've been through worse." The tall man stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate, measured. "You haven't seen anything yet?" Suddenly, the tension snapped like a taut wire. Derek's crew opened fire. In an instant, the quiet man and the tall man moved as one. The quiet man's body seemed to blur as he sidestepped the first bullet that came toward him. His hand shot out with deadly precision, knocking one of Derek's men to the ground. The tall man moved with equal speed, grabbing a second attacker by the throat and slamming him into the nearby wall with bone-crushing force. Derek's heart pounded in his chest. His men were already faltering, and he knew it was over. They were outmatched, outclassed, but he refused to admit it, refused to give up. He raised his weapon, aimed at the quiet man, and pulled the trigger. The quiet man ducked, the bullet whizzing past him, missing by mere inches. In a fluid motion, the quiet man closed the distance between them, his hand grabbing Derek's wrist, twisting it with horrifying strength. The gun fell to the ground with a metallic clatter. "You've lost," the quiet man whispered, his voice cold. Derek's wrist cracked under the pressure, and he cried out in pain. His other men were still firing, but they had no chance. The two black soldiers were untouchable, their movements too fast, too precise. The last of Derek's crew dropped like dominoes. "Stop!" Derek shouted, trying to pry the quiet man's hand off his arm. His body shook from fear and anger. "I'll make you regret this. You'll never get away with it." The quiet man tilted his head, studying Derek for a moment. Then, with a sudden, brutal motion, he flung Derek to the ground, where he landed with a sickening thud. "Regret?" the quiet man repeated, his voice almost amused. "You're the one who should regret it." The tall man approached, his expression unreadable. "You came for us, but you failed to understand one simple thing. We don't run. And we never back down." Derek tried to scramble to his feet, but his body wouldn't obey. He was broken, physically and mentally. The fight had drained him of everything, every ounce of will, every drop of defiance. And now, he knew, there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. "This is where your story ends, Derek," the tall man said, kneeling down to meet him eye to eye. His voice was low, but the finality in it sent a chill down Derek's spine. The quiet man crouched beside him, his gaze piercing. "You had your chance. Now you'll pay for what you've done." Derek's breath was shallow, his mind spinning. He couldn't understand. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now, he was at the mercy of these two men who had shown him how little he mattered in the grand scheme of things. I can still help you," Derek stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can get you whatever you want, money, power. I can make things right." The quiet man's expression softened for a brief moment, as if contemplating Derek's offer. But then, without warning, he stood up, his eyes cold once more. "You think we want your money?" the quiet man said. "You think we need anything from someone like you?" The tall man's eyes narrowed. "We've been through hell and back. We've seen the worst this world has to offer. And men like you, men who abuse power, who hurt others for their own gain, they don't deserve mercy." Derek's heart raced as he looked between the two men. This wasn't just a fight. This was something personal. They weren't going to let him walk away. He had pushed them too far, and now he had to pay the price. The quiet man took a step back, and Derek felt the ground slip beneath him as he realized the finality of his fate. There was no escape. There was no more fight left in him. He had lost. And in that moment, as he lay on the cold concrete, Derek understood something he had never before. Power was not in numbers, not in money, not in control. It was in the ability to survive, to stand tall, to never back down no matter the odds. And these men had that power. The quiet man spoke one last time, his voice soft but unwavering. "This is over, Dirk. You should have known better." With that, the two black soldiers turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the night. Derek remained on the ground, broken, beaten, and alone. He had gambled everything and lost. The war was over, and he was just another casualty in a world that had no place for men like him. The quiet man and the tall man vanished into the shadows, their figures disappearing as if they had never been there. Derek's world had crumbled, and he knew he would never forget the lesson they had taught him. Some battles were never meant to be won. The story ended not with a fight, but with a quiet, undeniable victory.